Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. This is our second Plant Protein Alliance of Alberta webinar. And today we're talking about supply chain. And we're looking at the whole range of the supply chain, all the way from the farm to the grocery store. And we've got some very special guests with us today. We'll be going quickly through the introductions. We'll have about 20 minutes of presentation, followed by community discussion. And feel free to put your thoughts in the chat box and your questions in the chat. Barb will be monitoring it and calling out the questions as she sees them. And then we'll just wrap it up. So the whole webinar won't take more than an hour. It's a quick webinar intended to be enjoyed over a cup of coffee. So let's get going. So myself, I'm Shannon Snaden. I'm the marketing specialist with Plant Protein Alliance. I've been helping out since January, and along with me is my co-host Barb, and she's the communications manager at Plant Protein Alliance. And we also have our special guest Chris Chivolo, who is the president and CEO of WA Grain and Pulse Solutions, as well as Eunice Wong, who is customer category sales strategy manager for Weston Foods. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm sure we'll have a lot to learn from you. A little bit of background on Plant Protein Alliance for those who aren't familiar. We are a relatively new nonprofit. And what we do is we connect people to help Alberta become global leaders in plant-based ingredient processing. And we're part of a pan-prairie initiative. So all across the prairies, we're working to improve processing of grains and plant-based proteins. We host a lot of networking events that are well received across the year, and this webinar series is a new venture for us. So we're learning alongside you. And the webinar series started out last week with talking about the government programs for assistance. Today is about supply chain, and then we'll have a consumer behavior webinar talking about the global supply chains as well. And then we're going to finish it off by looking at what's coming in the future. What is this new normal that we're looking at? We also have a monthly newsletter that is well received. I highly recommend signing up for it. And you can sign up for it on our website, ppaa.ca. And now to the special presentation.
Okay, this is just a few things we did as a company. Everybody got a million emails from all the companies that had to put in COVID-19 protocol once the crisis started developing. So we were no exception. The only difference is we didn't send it to every single person on our email list 3 times. So these are the steps that are also posted on our website and at all our locations. But the big difference is that we had to employ was we always wear masks anyway at our locations because they're dusty, so that wasn't anything new, but we wipe down all the common areas twice a day. The cleaning people that come in on weekends disinfect everything, maintaining social distancing, and the big change was not letting customers or delivery drivers out of their vehicles unless absolutely necessary, so the paperwork gets handed in the windows or sent digitally after the deliveries with all the information on it. Okay. So just how the COVID shutdown affected us or the pulse industry in general. Main issue resulted because so many containers go to Asia. Typically, they're a big importer of pulses and container shipments. So containers got tied up in the docks in China and Singapore and some places for 6 weeks, which caused a massive shortage of containers for reloading in North America and other countries as well. But that's our biggest thing. The bulk vessel shippers, as a matter of fact, weren't affected too badly. They're The bulk vessels did get tied up, but they didn't run into as many delays getting vessels back to reload. Transloaders, that's who we ship rail cars and intermodals to port, and then they transfer them into containers. So the transloaders would get in, let's say, 1,000 containers, and then have to figure out who to allocate to when there was 4,000 or 5,000 containers in demand. So very tight shipping in February, March. We as a company were down roughly 30%, but it's already clearing up somewhat, just as containers are released from ports. So April, actually, we were bang on budget for shipping, so good recovery so far, but we're not totally out of the water yet. There's still some delays. So the way that impacts us as a shipper and other shippers like us is you run higher inventory when your rail cars aren't allowed to be loaded. So you sit longer on inventory and run a few higher costs, which backs up to the producer level by having us to delay contracts for delivery, which the farmers are, especially this time of year with seeding upon us, they want to get their contracts in, go seeding and pick things up later on. So, and the end buyer shipments are delayed, which causes, cash shortages down the line. If we don't get paid, then, things slow down all the way through. So looks like we're through the worst times as far as that goes now. So the biggest delays now, some ports in the world, once a ship shows up for unloading, they have to sit for 14 days before they can unload. Most countries are changing so that if they were 14 days in transit from their last stop, they're okay. So, and 7 days in transit, they'd have to sit for another 7 days. So just a few little things that add up to delays and postponing contracts. And it's just a funky little diagram. I don't like circles, so I didn't make a circle. So this kind of explains it in easy terms. There's lots of supply in the world, but most of it, quite honestly, is in Canada for pulses. The inland processing is adequate, and it's actually more than adequate. There's lots of processing to ship upon demand, and the consumer demand is quite high, but it still doesn't stress the processing capacity because there still is lots available. And then what happened then, everything's good to that point. The shipping capacity gets constrained due to lack of containers. That causes product to back up at port and inland facilities and then turn on farm. So it just, as they say, something always rolls downhill. But, and then sales get deferred, some contracts canceled, which causes the buyers to wait and the shelves to run bare. And that has happened in some countries where people stocked up on pulses and the buyers or importers can't get product quick enough to meet the immediate demand. Long term, they'll be fine. Okay, Shannon. And just recapping that, the China shutdown backed up container supply a good 6 weeks. Quarantines at ports added more time delays for containers to be released, and that caused backup at shipping facilities. Another thing I didn't mention, as everybody started panicking and really starting to worry about their livelihoods and everything else, a lot of buyers that had the cash for payments held on to them a little longer, which causes payment delays. And I think that's, oh, did you mute me? Thank you. Consumers were overstocking on canned goods and dry goods, creating some short-term shortages and raising short-term demand. Now, I put Europe in here because they're a prime example that caught us off guard. We have 3 really good buyers in Europe, and they basically ran out of product. They got totally surprised. They weren't due to reorder till this summer. And they phoned, 3 of them phoned on a Monday morning about a month ago saying, we're out of peas. How quick can you get them here? And quick is 6 weeks from, loading to when it arrives at port in Europe in a good shipment. So there's no quick way to supply, mainly because buyers ran hand to mouth for the last 3 years. Nobody stocked up because they knew product was just around the corner, and when it came time that they needed it fast, it was hard to meet the demand. Short term, we're good now. And something we did as a company because of the inconsistencies of shipment is we typically had 1 to 2 month delivery periods on our contracts with farmers. Now we've gone to 3 months, and we've done the same thing on the sales side, just to protect ourselves against container shortages or interruptions. Now, I picked an industry that's pretty easy to see the immediate damage because of supply chain breakdowns. Alberta cattle is always on everybody's mind because it's just a big part of the industry in Alberta and Western Canada. So this is just an example using JBS and the Cargill plant. They can process 9,000 head per day, or pretty close between the two plants. And that capacity has fallen to 1,500 head per day. It's going to go up by 1,200 next week when Cargill adds 1 shift. But the consumer demand has always been there, and it's probably a bit higher than normal just because of people stocking up. So the demand is still there. So typically you would see if demand is outpacing supply, beef prices will soar. And on the other side, because the processors can't take 9,000 head per day, 75 head per day that were destined for the meatpacking plants have to stay in the farm or feedlot, which causes losses because the farmers have to feed them longer if they don't have to euthanize them. And the next chart shows what I'm talking about on the price breakdown. You can probably all guess which one is the price of boxed beef and which one is the price that farmers are getting for cattle right now. Cattle futures have fallen a lot in the last month, and the price of beef, as processing was cut back because of shutdowns, has also gone through the roof. So the cattle industry right now can clearly see the breakdown in the supply chain, far more than our industry. And just some interesting notes on the cattle industry. Canadian processors process 1.3 million tons of beef, and of that, roughly 40% is exported. Well, you can count on right now the fact that you can bet Cargill and JBS aren't exporting a whole bunch right now because we have to look after our domestic system. And I'm sure Eunice is seeing the focus on the domestic side over exports from the suppliers as well. 74% of our exports go to the US. So until they get their restaurants going, which is coming, and so on and so forth, that demand probably isn't quite there right now, which helps our domestic side. Just a really neat fact, Canadians eat 18 kilograms of beef per person per year. Japan is almost 5 times that, 4.5 times as much beef per person in Japan. I just thought that was a kind of a neat fact. So Cargill, JBS is at 1 shift, and Cargill will be back at 1 shift on Monday. So we'll be back up to about 30% of capacity. And the feedlots and cattle producers, I'm sure everybody knows by now, they're backing up with nowhere to go. So, okay, Shannon. Other commodities very negatively affected by COVID-19 from what I see. Corn primarily affects the US with their massive corn production, but 40% of US corn typically goes for ethanol production. And I just read this morning that half of the ethanol plants are shut down right now because there's no demand. So that doesn't bode well for corn futures over the next little while, especially with massive acres going in right now. For all meat production, processing plant closures have affected beef, pork, chicken. There's lots of cases of pigs being euthanized simply because farmers have nowhere to go and their barns are full, and they've got a crop of weanlings coming on. So there's lots of sad stories in the pork industry right now. And chicken plants as well. I've seen in BC, they were euthanizing a lot of chickens. We all seen the videos, I'm sure, of milk producers, dairy farmers dumping milk because you can hear in some cases demand was down or processing wasn't adequate enough to handle everything. There's a few stories on the dairy side, but cheese was very greatly affected by restaurant shutdowns, similar to French fries. So French fry consumption, as Eunice was mentioning beforehand, drastically reduced due to restaurant closures around the world. Netherlands, Belgium, Canada, Eastern Canada, especially in Southern Alberta with the potato plants. Idaho, you're seeing stories now where potatoes are going to be going to waste. Vegetables and fruit, we're going to see the worst of it. I was reading stories this morning in Mexico because of labor shortages and such that tomatoes are being thrown out or basically given away to anybody that'll take them. We'll see more of that if lack of workers in many countries continues because of COVID-19. But we can envision crops being left in fields or taken off and then not being able to be taken to market fast enough, which again will cause price inflation, and the farmers don't get to capitalize on any of that inflation, of course. And I think the next picture kind of sums up those comments. The products that are most subject to waste, if they are limited from processors or distributors shutting down, or cattle as mentioned, pork, chickens, fresh fruit and vegetables, milk and dairy, and potatoes. So I didn't hear this week, Cavendish Farms is a major contractor on Prince Edward Island and in Southern Alberta, and I think they were making an announcement on cutting back their contracts this week, but I wasn't able to find what that ended up as. So, and I believe that's my last slide, if I'm not mistaken. Yes.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Chris.
You're very welcome.
And now we'll have Eunice with the other side of the supply chain from the grocery perspective.
All right. Well, thank you, Shannon. Thank you, PPAA, for having me here. Lovely to see some familiar names on the board. So as Shannon introduced earlier, I work for Weston Foods, which is one of North America's biggest bakeries. We have a retail arm that mostly supplies supermarkets, and we have a food service arm that mostly services restaurants. So today I want to talk just more broadly about how COVID-19 has affected the food industry in North America, kind of see a little bit on the retail side and a little bit on the restaurant side, and how that, or what that means in terms of supply chain challenges. And you'll see a lot of parallels in my presentation to what Chris has just shown us. If we can just go to the next slide, please, Shannon. So in the last 7 weeks, if you've been brave enough to leave your house, you have probably seen this scenario. So on one side, we have what's going on at retail stores, which is essentially Black Friday on repeat, except everyone is gifting their family toilet paper and pasta. On the other side is where we have restaurants, which is a more grim picture. So because of rules in place against dining out, some restaurants have switched to takeout and delivery only. The ones that haven't been able to adapt, unfortunately, have had to shut their doors temporarily. And in more extreme cases, some restaurants haven't been able to weather this financial storm and have closed their doors permanently. And that really comes from the fact that North Americans split our food budget about 50-50 between meals that are prepared in the home and meals that are purchased from restaurants. So right now, essentially, we have two arms. One of them is tied behind our backs, so the other arm has to work twice as hard as it used to meet all of our needs. As you can imagine, that has translated to a number of supply chain issues. Before I get into what the specific issues are, I just want to give a bit of context as to the speed at which we experience this problem and the size of the problem. So if we can go to the next slide, please. On the left side, we see US retail food sales dollars, same weeks versus the same weeks last year. So on the left side, you see in early March, there's a little bit of an uptick in consumer demand for retail food. So that's like food that you would buy at grocery stores, at like warehouses like Costco, that kind of stuff. the moment the WHO declared COVID-19 as a pandemic, we saw those crazy sales spikes. That's when folks were going into stores and hoarding and buying tons of stuff, stockpiling everything that they can get their hands on. In more recent weeks, we've seen some of that spike taper off a bit, but all in all, we're still seeing a substantial bump versus the same weeks last year. And that's a function of people needing more food to consume at home because restaurants aren't as available an option as they were before. So speaking of restaurants, we are going to now look at the right-hand side of the chart, which is what's going on in terms of seated diners in US and Canada across roughly the same time period. So we see that around March, we saw a nosedive in the number of seated diners versus the same period last year. And by about the third week of March, there are essentially no diners sitting in restaurants and dining in. And most restaurants, in fact, 80% of restaurants have said that switching to takeout and delivery has not been sufficient to recover the losses that they've experienced from the lack of seated diners. So this translates to a number of supply chain challenges, and I want to talk about them in 6 broad themes. The first is about targeted production. Many food producers produce specific to what their clients need. So for example, we have farmers that grow things like heirloom tomatoes, microgreens, or Jerusalem artichokes. Those are products that are more targeted towards restaurants, and it's hard to find retail demand for it and just kind of shift the finished goods over to a supermarket to sell. Consumers are just not really looking for that product. Related to that is food processors. So processors that service restaurants tend to package their goods in these industrial-sized packs. So as much as we're seeing a lot of retail customers stockpiling, we're hard-pressed to find families that want a 50-pound bag of onions or 50-pound bag of tomatoes. So the shift to, like, even though the finished goods that are already harvested in the field, it's if it's not going to restaurants, it's not always easy to translate that into a retail sale. The next piece I'd like to talk about is safety stock. In recent years, a lot of companies have switched to just-in-time manufacturing, and that's in the interest of reducing their carrying cost of inventory. So many food producers don't have more than a couple of weeks of finished goods. I'm talking like retail goods like pasta, canned soups, and that kind of stuff. So when the demand spikes, a lot of the safety stock was just depleted almost instantaneously. And then related to that is the third theme, which is staggered demand spikes. So consumers don't buy every category in that stockpiling quantity all at once. As COVID-19 developed, people were buying things in different ways. So the first wave was when people first began to hear about COVID-19 and thinking about it. So folks were buying things that were more health-oriented or prevention-oriented. We're talking things like vitamins, supplements, wipes, hand sanitizers. And then came the active preparation stage. That's when we saw people go into stores and buy all that dry, shelf-stable grocery goods. So like your pastas, your bread, your canned goods, frozen vegetables. And then we're currently in what's called the cocooning stage, which is we've all accepted that we're going to be staying home for a little while. And so we buy food that gives us comfort and gives us entertainment. So if you're currently sitting in front of your screen in sweatpants, or if you're at all like me, you have been eating more than your fair share of snacks. So we've seen the sales volume of snacking goods like cookies and ice cream and that kind of stuff go up. We're also seeing, like we talked a little bit about earlier, people are buying a lot more flour and yeast because they're looking for their food ingredients to also be entertainment, since people are doing baking projects at home. The fourth theme I want to talk about is international ingredients. So this ties into what Chris was talking about earlier. Because of certain port closures or delays, it's been a challenge getting international ingredients in some instances. So in Canada, we've been relatively fortunate that the bulk of our food comes from within the continent. I'm talking Canada, US, and Mexico. So we have been more or less self-sufficient. That being said, as Chris has alluded to, in more recent weeks, we're seeing a lot of manufacturing plants, especially in the meat industry, having to shut down or drastically reduce their production levels. So we know that we're going to be seeing a bit of a challenge on that end. The biggest hurdle for us in terms of international ingredients is sourcing from places like Asia because of the port shutdowns. So when you go to your supermarket, you may see that some of your exotic produce that used to be available all year round isn't as readily available as they used to be. Related to that is packaging. So a lot of Canadian producers have been able to produce their goods using domestically sourced ingredients, but packaging is where they're seeing some headwinds. Because of the cost of sourcing packaging, a lot of companies get their packaging from overseas, which translates to a longer lead time. So for example, Robinhood, the flour company, have recently had to switch from their iconic yellow bags of flowers to a generic white bag. And that's because they haven't been able to get their yellow bags back in stock, but they're able to produce the flour. So in order to keep the sales going and get their products onto retail shelves, they've switched to a slightly different packaging for the time being. And then the last theme I want to talk about in terms of challenges is labor restrictions. So Chris has alluded to some of this earlier. As manufacturing plants put in social distancing measures, or as people have to call out sick, or people have to take time off to take care of their family as related to COVID-19, we're seeing some plants experience some staffing shortages. So in some cases, that has negatively affected the production rates. So what is the industry doing to try to remedy the situation? Can we go to the next slide, please? So there are kind of 8 broad things that I'd like to talk about in terms of remedies, and they all really come down to companies having a good risk management plan or program in place. The first bit is about sourcing buffer ingredients. So the well-managed companies have been sourcing buffer ingredients and building their buffer stocks probably since January or February. So that's, gathering ingredients, anticipating that there may be a supply interruption in coming months. Some companies have gone to using some backup suppliers. Related to that is maximizing production run efficiencies. So a lot of manufacturers that service many customers have switched away from producing niche goods that are specific to each account and gone to focusing on items that are common across multiple clients. That way, you can run your production runs for longer and reduce the amount of downtime in between. So Weston Foods, for example, in Canada, we make Wonder Bread, and I'm sure you've seen Wonder Bread at many places. We also make a lot of account-specific products for different customers. So in those weeks when the demands were really spiking, we have switched to focusing our production resources on the Wonder Bread business, which we can use to service more than one customer, and switched away temporarily from some of the more specific niche items. The third remedy that I want to talk about is about minimizing visitors to sites. So most plants that I know of, both within Weston and some of our industry colleagues, have kept their plants to essential personnel only. So even visitors, like corporate visitors, are discouraged from going because we are all looking to reduce the risk of contamination. And in the case where there is a positive COVID-19 test, it's important for companies to have a good facilities closure plan in place, and ideally also a backup production plan. So that means when someone at a production facility tests positive for COVID-19, the well-run companies have a detailed procedure in place in terms of when they shut down, how they notify the staff, how they sanitize the facility, and in cases where it is possible, how they would shift some of that manufacturing capacity to another location that's still running so that we keep the wheels on the bus. Related to that is the fifth point. It's again about shifting resources. So at Weston, like I mentioned earlier, we have a food service arm and we have a retail arm. As you can imagine, the food service business has fallen off quite a bit. So we have shifted internally some of our manufacturing and our transport resources to support the retail demand spikes. And then there are cases where our internal resources alone are not enough to respond to some of those spikes. So those are cases where we have engaged ad hoc partners, so for example, trucking companies, to meet those needs. There are going to be situations where we're not able to match a finished good to a paying customer, and those are the instances when we donate to nonprofit organizations such as food banks and shelters, just to try to match that food to at least some kind of an end user who is in need. And the last remedy that I want to talk about, probably the most important one, is about taking care of your people. So the well-run companies have really good health and safety protocols in place and do a spectacular job communicating that to their staff. So that means giving people the tools that they need to work remotely as much as possible. In cases where that isn't an option, giving the people that have to come on site the right PPE. So Chris has talked about some of that in his presentation. Putting in the right social distancing measures, giving people breaks. Like, we hear that, people get caught up in this gloom and doom and this spike in production need and production and retail demand, but it's important that we treat people like people. So giving people the appropriate breaks, encouraging things like the use of humor, and in the case where folks need to be pulled off site, so whether it's they think they're ill or they have a family member who is ill, giving your staff clear direction on when they need to self-isolate, when they need to get tested, and in situations where they do need to have time off, how and whether they will be compensated for their absence or during their absence is really important. It's a kind of the main thing is about keeping the company functioning and removing panic from the equation. So that kind of wraps up the core of my presentation. I just want to close with a few forward-looking thoughts. COVID-19 is an evolving situation. We are hearing that today's May 1st, and there are a number of jurisdictions that are starting to open up. Some places are allowing restaurant dine-in again. Some places are looking at opening up schools. So it is possible that we could see a second wave of outbreaks. So every food manufacturer and retailer that I've worked with has been trying to stay on their toes and be as nimble as they possibly can to respond to those short-term changes. In the longer run, what we're anticipating with regards to retail and food service is we may see a substantially higher use of e-commerce in food purchase. We may see a rise of things like micro-fulfillment center and ghost kitchens to meet the needs of all those online purchases. And in the even longer run, we're anticipating to see what we call democratization of the supply chain. So that's encouraging people to buy more directly from producers. So you may see more farmers markets shifting potentially to a digital format where people can buy from the folks that produce the food and skip over the bottlenecks in the middle that have created some of the supply chain challenges. And with that, I just want to close up and thank PPAA for inviting me today, and thank everyone for paying attention. If you have any questions, please let us know in the chat.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Eunice. That was a great presentation. So we're now opening it up for the community discussion portion. So please feel welcome to start entering your questions into the chat at this moment, and Barb will call them out for our two guest speakers.
So we have a question, I guess, to probably both of you. If you're looking to make changes in your current supply chain coming out of this pandemic. So that's sort of again, a longer term look. You want to go first, Chris, or?
Yeah, just had to figure out how to unmute myself. We don't have to make a lot of changes. Like I said, our particular industry wasn't hit too hard, but it's a lot simpler than someone like Weston or large companies that are sourcing ingredients from all over the place. We likely will we probably won't have to do anything, but I'm pretty sure our end users overseas are looking to build, as Eunice mentioned, buffer stocks once again, like they used to, just in case of supply chain disruptions like they're seeing right now. So it's affected our buyers more than it's affected us, but I guess in general, it's going to go from hand to mouth to at least having something in the closet for emergencies.
Okay, and Eunice?
Yeah, pretty similar answer to Chris. Like the buffer stock angle is something that I know a lot of food manufacturers are looking at exploring. With something like food, most goods in Canada have roughly a 1-year government mandated shelf life. So for example, if you manufacture a can of soup today, the best before date on there is going to be 365 days from now. And then of course the shelf life would be even shorter for stuff like bread. So it's going to be a little bit of a challenge because the cost of building that buffer stock is going to be not low. So it's something that we'll have to explore from the financial angle and figure out whether this buffer stock is worth keeping and incurring the cost for keeping, knowing that, you know, we talk about COVID-19 as being kind of a once in 100 years situation or disaster. So if we make a change now, there's a question of how will this change affect or help us be better prepared for the next disaster? Because, you know, 100 years from now, we might all be ingesting our food in pill form or in intravenously or what have you.
Right. But it's also not a short, that's going to, the implications here are not going to end short term. It's a longer term problem.
Absolutely. Absolutely. There's a lot of, you know, we'll continue evaluating, and I'm sure when everything goes back to somewhat of a normal, we'll be having a deeper postmortem on how we would want to revamp the supply chain going forward.
And then a question for you specifically, Chris, is when you talk about production capacity for pulses, what type of production are you talking about?
That's from Dana. Hi, Dana. It's more, I was talking about processing capacity and not so much production capacity. By processing capacity, it would be how much facilities like ours can put through, you know, in a month to meet demand. And in Western Canada, there's likely a little bit of excess capacity. If everybody could run full tilt, we could supply the world pretty easily, especially when you add the line companies in like Viterra and Cargill and JRI. So getting product out isn't a problem from our facilities inland. The problems always arise from the railways or container shortages or avalanches that cause backups and things like that. So processing, there's lots. Production in itself, there's plenty of production capacity in Canada where we export, I think, close to 90% of our pulses already. So production isn't an issue as far as pulse production goes.
So I think some of it is the confusion, but then when we start talking about the processing, more like fractionation and that type of thing, where we don't have that kind of capacity, that value added capacity here that I know you're interested in as well, and many others would like to get developed here in Alberta.
Yes.
Okay. So Wade has a question for both of you about, do you see the government playing a more active role in large companies' supply chain management? So, so mandating, I guess, a larger increase in that safety stock.
That would be interesting to see if the government can mandate someone like Weston's and Loblaws and Costco and the group to have a policy, government mandated policy in place. So Eunice, you can have that one.
Thanks, Chris. I mean, this is just personal opinion. We know that government involved. So historically, Canada has had a pretty protectionist food supply. You know, we have protectionist policies in place for dairy, for beef, poultry, wheat, quite a few of our core food supply groups. And in the last, let's call it 10 years, the government has leaned more towards stepping away from regulation. So it's going to be difficult for the government to step in, more so than not, to say, hey, in light of COVID-19, we're going to mandate that you do X, Y, and Z. So personally, I don't see this being a really a major priority of the government to mandate companies to build safety stock. It might be more of an encouragement or at a local level, like so provincial or municipal level, of saying, hey, we encourage retailers to do X, Y, Z to make sure that people don't run into situations where someone is stockpiling and someone who's coming off a 12-hour healthcare worker shift goes to a store and it's completely depleted. So it's more soft rules versus hard rules. I guess that's how I would frame it.
Something I can see coming out of this, not so much for the Westons of the world or ourselves, is very stringent and agreed upon safety protocol in the case of pandemic shutdowns in meat plants, things like that. There's going to have to be backup plans and pandemic plans to assure that production can still take place in the face of adversity. I can see that becoming more of a mandated method in the future.
Yeah, fully agree. Like with meat is one of the most challenging industries. Like if you've ever seen videos or photos or have been inside of a meat plant, you'll see that unlike, like for us, like bakeries, it's a little bit easier to space out your workers and maintain that 6 foot or 2 meter distance between individuals. Meat plants, a lot of times people are working shoulder to shoulder. And that obviously increases the risk of infection. And once an infection happens, there's going to be a need to shut down. So it's almost like it's really hard to reduce the risk. And when the risk becomes a problem, it becomes a relatively severe problem. So to Chris's point, we may see more government requirements from the safety angle of how plants need to react to shutdowns and a backup plan in place to keep the supply running.
Right. Okay. Thank you. And a question about collaborating with ad hoc partners. Is that a plan you had in place, or is this something you just think of on the foot?
Oh, thank you, Gagan, for that question. Good to see you. I'll speak for Weston and a few colleagues, like industry colleagues that we know about. Because of Canada's supply chain for retail, the way it's structured, Canada is a really expansive country, and we have really a broad range of weather extremes. So knowing that this type of stuff happens, a lot of companies do have some backup ad hoc partners kind of in their back pocket. So there would be key contractors that they typically work with. But we often also have backup, say, transportation company, and that's like the main focus here. We kind of have an established relationship, but we just don't work closely with them all the time to respond to changes in demand. So even out of the context of COVID, sometimes we'll see like if there's a major snowstorm in a particular area of Canada, we may need to engage a different transport company to help get the goods from the manufacturing facilities to stores. We have things in place where we know, oh crap, a truck driver hit a moose. So how do we have a backup, basically a backup truck in place to help take that load of goods to where it needs to go? So there are kind of backup ad hoc partners that we tend to have a list of, and then COVID-19 has just escalated the degree of interaction we have with them.
Great, thank you. So Aaron has, what are you hearing about shifts to a more local supply chain? And what are your thoughts about, so it's kind of a two-part, so the local and then your thoughts about Alberta's opportunities in the global supply chain? Do you want to start, Chris?
Hearing about shifts to a more local to local supply chain. Well, it doesn't affect us in our industry that much right now that we would have to change everything. And I don't think our end users overseas that are buying our pulses will change a whole lot as far as what crops they grow. They don't grow green peas in India, or a lot of green peas in India, because it doesn't work. They grow them as a fresh vegetable, for instance. China, they need all their acres to go into corn, wheat, and as many soybeans as they can, so they don't grow a lot of peas. So most of the countries that import our products have to import our products. More production in their own countries is not an option. Although when you look at someone like China, for instance, they are opening up more soybeans in Russia. They want more contracts in Russia and the Ukraine, so they don't have to rely on the US and Brazil as much in the future. So there's always some changes to where crops are grown, but really and truly through the last 100 years, most countries have figured out what they're good at growing, and they grow them because that's the most beneficial to them locally. The Indian government keeps pushing pulses, but unless they raise the minimum support prices up so that it beats the heck out of wheat and other crops, they'll be unsuccessful getting what they want every year. But I don't foresee a lot of changes in our supply chain, and I don't know if Weston can get bananas growing in Tabor either, so I don't know how much they can change.
We're trying with oranges first, those Canadian oranges. Yeah, totally want to echo what Chris has been saying. The broad scale globally, it's kind of that competitive advantage thing. Most countries grow what they grow because they're good at it and they can command the best price in the market, and they have the best infrastructure in place to get their goods to market. On a smaller scale, I think with Canada, having a lot of folks that are educated and financially capable, there may be kind of that feel-good sentiment on a small scale that people are looking to buy more locally. So there's a potentially a little bit of a boost on a small scale to moving towards local supply chains. And that's in Alberta, it might be shifting your summer barbecue corn from going to from getting it from a supermarket to getting Tabor corn, like that type of stuff. Yes, we will probably in the short term see a little bit of that. But then the other piece of the puzzle is we are seeing a lot of folks now or in the coming months having more financial challenges as a result of the economy not doing so well. So that also becomes a little bit harder for folks to buy direct from certain farmers market or more premium local goods. So to Chris's point, large scale, probably not a huge change. Small scale, we may see kind of dribs and drabs of this stuff coming in.
Yeah, I fully expect you'll see the local butchers being busier, the local farmer that bakes pies, and like Pearson Berry Farm, they had decided to open up one Sunday about 3 weeks ago and see how many customers wanted to come by for drive-through pies and baked goods, and it was probably a 1.5 mile long lineup to get in there. We waited for 2.5 hours ourselves.
Wow, that is dedication.
Pie there.
They're good pies.
And a lot of it is like, people looking for that comfort of, knowing that they're doing a good thing for their community by supporting a local producer. And, when you have nowhere else to go on a weekend, you may be okay about going to line up for 2 hours for a specialty pie.
And that was the exact case. Everybody in the lineup was chatting from their windows saying, yeah, don't have anything better to do.
Well, that kind of leads into Scott's question about often downturns in the economy can present new opportunities. And if you had to pick one component of the supply chain that will actually benefit from the pandemic, what would that be? Chris?
I would say definitely the local suppliers that will benefit. We all know the local butcher shops most of them have closed down over the years, and it's rare to see a Pearson's Berry Farm companies like that doing so well to where they might actually, want things return to normal and they have the retail customers back. That bodes well for success of what they're doing, maybe some expansion, maybe the butcher shops, go up in capacity a little bit. Just, I can see it supporting the very local businesses in the future. And on Twitter, I've seen a lot of comments towards that end where local abattoirs would like to do more and take the focus off what if something happens to my grocery store or runs out of meat. And I can see people taking advantage of this situation in the future.
Eunice, do you have a...
I would say the distribution channels are going to see a shift. So I don't know if it's a benefit, but I can see a shift in more online activity and less face-to-face brick and mortar. So consumers are going to move towards more online food ordering. So right now, as an example, overall, we're talking all consumer goods. So food, clothing, furniture, makeup, drugs, all of that stuff on average. Before COVID, Canada's online sales accounts for about 10% of that total consumer goods market. Food was only about 4% before COVID because the channels are not really well developed. Before, if you wanted to order a pie, it's a little bit tricky. Not a whole lot of places can deliver a pie to your door.
Mm-hmm.
with the rapid development of COVID, a lot of retailers have really stepped up their online offering, whether that's through a delivery, a to your door type delivery service, or a curbside pickup / click and collect, however you want to name that. So which is, you order and then you show up at the front of the store and they have your order all packaged up and your credit card's already been charged. And then there's like the third party delivery companies like your Instacarts, who, you order things through an app through the third party company. They send a person to go to the same grocery stores that you normally would have already gone to. So what we anticipate is the development of these online systems, mostly in the form of micro fulfillment centers and its food service counterpart, which is ghost kitchens. So essentially they're places that are set up to sell food, but they don't really expect walk-in customers. They're the only people that they expect to come through their doors are the delivery people. So we are anticipating that kind of a shift. So on the consumer side, more use of online, and then on the distribution side, a shift from a brick and mortar location to meet the needs to essentially a faceless warehouse type setup that meets the needs of those online orders.
Okay. Are the ghost kitchens generally small or large, like operations?
It really varies. So they're a little bit more developed in the States, and we have seen cases where, so think of this as historically, if you were to want to eat Italian food, you would order from your favorite Italian restaurant, and then either you went to pick it up yourself or a delivery person, either employed by the restaurant or in more recent years employed by or as a contractor for someone like Uber Eats, that will come bring the food to your door. And that food is produced by that Italian restaurant, and that kitchen only makes that type of food. In the US, we're seeing some restaurants move to a ghost kitchen version of that just services their restaurant. And we're also seeing broader scale restaurants that may have one section that makes the Italian food, and then another section that makes Korean food, and another section that makes, Mexican food. And when you put in your online order, all of that food is being churned out from those ghost kitchens. So it's all out of the same place, right, but you think you're ordering from different restaurants.
Okay. And Ross asks, is there or do you see an increased interest in hydroponic and greenhouse production in Canada to increase food security and provide a greater variety of food?
Oh, I'm sure there are people looking at doing that with the hype around local lately. If you look at Lacombe, the greenhouses there, the greenhouses down by Medicine Hat, Redcliffe? There's quite a few greenhouses now, and I'm that person that if you don't have local tomatoes, and I know they grow in Lacombe and in southern Alberta all year round, if you're the co-op and you don't have a local Alberta grown tomato, I leave the shopping cart full and I walk out and go to the next store. So there's not too many people as nasty as I am. It embarrasses the hell out of my wife when I do that. But yeah. I always look for local, but I don't speak for the average consumer who's looking for maybe the cheaper tomato and doesn't care if it comes from Mexico or California. But I guess now you might see more people like me doing it more for supporting the local supply chain than you do just being nasty like me.
Eunice, do you have a comment?
So we just ad hoc. We are hearing more interest in the use of hydroponic growth and greenhouses. And if you talk to folks that are in the kind of tech innovation entrepreneurship space, there's a lot of pitches around this type of idea, especially on capitalizing on widely available land that's in the Canadian prairies. I know Shannon, you're quite involved in the entrepreneurship space. I don't know if you've encountered pitches or discussions around this. So on an ad hoc level, we know there's interest. I think the question is, because these tend to be relatively high capital projects, getting them to the execution piece, let alone go into market, that's going to be the hurdle.
Yeah.
So I don't know if Shannon, you have anything to add from your time in the entrepreneurship space.
You're right, Eunice. The use of technology is being seen as increasingly important in agriculture to stay competitive. There is one good example I like to talk about. It's Lufa Farms in Montreal, where they have they're growing herbs and small plants for use in restaurants in high rises in Montreal. And it's all fully automated, tray grown hydroponic plants, which is perhaps an indicator for what we could see in the future in Calgary.
Yeah, I think you will see the focus to the balcony gardens and things like that. There's a company in Calgary, and their name escapes me right now, that if you're interested in doing it in your place, they will sell you the whole kit and caboodle, from the watering kit, the soil, the seeds, the instructions on how to grow your own garden in your apartment, sort of thing. So, and they're doing quite well. I was at a presentation with them about a year ago. So I definitely can see more focus on the balcony gardens to grow your own vegetables, but that's not going to quite change the landscape that much.
No, yeah. There seems to be a lot more to talk about vertical farming or vertical greenhouses. So I think there's going to be more and more, I think, coming from that area.
Yeah.
So another question for the experts. Are producers focusing on their top 20% of best-selling products? And how does that change in a product mix at retail level affecting producers? You alluded a little bit to that, Eunice, about how you're having to focus on your Wonder Bread and a little bit less on specialized products. If you want to start us off.
Yeah, so it's a mixed answer. It's yes and no. So strategically, it always makes sense to put your effort into the most highest reward, highest return items. So in some cases, in those couple of weeks when we saw the demand spike, we saw both Weston and some of our industry peers focus more on goods that are common across multiple accounts, and that's just to keep the supply chain in good shape, just to keep it flowing. It's not a sustainable strategy in the long run for a business like Weston to only focus on, say, the top 5 or 10 items, because our customers are not going to be happy with us if we say we can't produce the pies or donuts or cakes or cookies or all that other stuff that we used to make for you, but here's a bunch of Wonder Bread. So it's more of a to really put our focus just on the top selling items is kind of a short-term fix. In the long run, we do still want to keep our eye on that product mix. One is because of the client relationship, and two, there's obviously the financial angle too. So some things are in our product mix for profit, some things are there because of certain market or assortment roles that it needs to play. So long and short, the short answer to a long question, or short version of it, however you want to say that, is short term, yes, we are focusing on just the best sellers. But longer term, I'm talking more than a couple months out, we need to try to maintain some kind of normalcy with the full assortment mix.
Okay. So it's 2:00, which is the end for our webinar. So I'm sorry, but I'll have to cut off the questions. So thank you so much, everybody, for your great questions, and to our experts for their insight in answering. And I think we'll have to wrap stuff up, Shannon.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you very much for all the great questions. So some of the supply chain mitigation strategies that we discussed are listed here. So anticipating that there can be some plant closures, looking at what resources are coming into your facilities for production, really focusing on your cash flow, conducting the scenario planning, as Eunice talked to us about the moose and how Weston Foods always thinks about, if a truck is going through loaded with Wonder Bread and it hits a moose, what is their backup plan? So they're always doing scenario planning to think about what can we do next. As well, start thinking about the rebound, preparing for what our consumers going to be looking for in the future. And this brings us to next week. We're going to be talking with Professor David Hughes, who is a professor out of the United Kingdom, hilarious guy, and he's going to talk about consumer behavior, global supply chains. And after that, we'll be having Professor Sylvain Charlebois, and he will be talking about the new normal. If you're looking for more information about the processes that Chris had talked about for how they're dealing with COVID, his website is listed there, wagrain.ca, as well as Eunice's company, Weston Foods. Their URL is there. We're going to be posting the recording of this webinar on ppaa.ca under the resources section, where you can find all of our previous recordings in just a couple of days as well. Thank you so much for attending our second webinar. We hope you enjoyed it, and come and check it out another time. And thank you very much to our guests. And that concludes our meeting.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, PPAA.
Thanks, everyone. Talk to you again.